The old woman's fingers refused to let go of his jacket. Her entire body trembled as rain soaked through the thin sweater she wore, and every passing car sprayed icy water across the empty sidewalk without slowing down. Her breathing was uneven, her voice barely louder than the wind. "Please, don't leave me here. I can't remember which road leads home anymore." Ethan Carter looked up and down the deserted street, hoping someone else would stop, but every person who noticed them lowered their eyes and hurried away, as though helping an elderly stranger had suddenly become the most dangerous decision in the world. He had already worked 14 exhausting hours that day. His stomach had been empty since noon. His apartment was still nearly an hour away on foot, and tomorrow's shift started before sunrise. Every sensible thought told him to apologize and continue walking. Instead, he slipped off his own jacket and gently placed it over the old woman's shoulders before saying the words that would quietly rewrite his future forever. "It's all right, ma'am. I'll get you home." At that exact moment, neither of them noticed the black luxury sedan parked across the street with its headlights turned off. Neither of them noticed the man inside making a phone call. Neither of them noticed the small camera quietly recording every step Ethan was about to take. They simply disappeared into the rain together, while several miles away, flashing police lights surrounded the largest private estate in the entire city. Only 12 months later, helicopters would circle that same estate day and night as reporters from around the world fought for a place outside its gates. News anchors would interrupt live broadcasts just to mention Ethan Carter's name. Governments would request meetings with him. Business leaders would compete for a single hour of his time. Millions would wonder how an ordinary young man with no money, no family connections, and no influence had somehow become the most talked-about person on earth. Some believed he had uncovered a fortune. Others claimed he had manipulated one of the wealthiest women in America. Rumors spread faster than facts, and the truth became buried beneath endless headlines, speculation, and public outrage. Yet none of those stories began inside a mansion, a courtroom, or a boardroom. They began on one forgotten sidewalk where a frightened elderly woman simply asked for directions home, and one exhausted stranger chose compassion instead of convenience. That single decision, so ordinary that most people would have forgotten it by morning, quietly set into motion a chain of events that no one, not Ethan, not the old woman, not the people secretly watching them from the darkness, could possibly have imagined. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story you're about to hear is filled with unexpected turns, difficult choices, and moments that remind us how one act of kindness can echo far beyond the person standing in front of us. Now, let's go back to the beginning of that unforgettable night, because every remarkable story has a moment when everything could have unfolded differently. And for Ethan Carter, that moment arrived with a simple choice that almost never happened. Just 24 hours earlier, Ethan's life looked exactly the same as it had for years. At 23 years old, he rented a tiny apartment above an aging laundromat on the east side of Brookhaven, a city famous for its towering skyline, expensive neighborhoods, and thousands of people who somehow managed to feel completely alone. His apartment contained little more than a folding bed, a worn-out table, a second-hand bookshelf, and a small refrigerator that rarely held enough food for more than 2 days. The wallpaper peeled from the corners, the ceiling leaked whenever heavy rain arrived, and every month he wondered whether this would finally be the month he could no longer afford the rent. During the day, he worked deliveries, stocked shelves during the evening, and accepted whatever temporary jobs appeared over weekends simply to keep himself afloat. His coworkers liked him well enough, but friendships rarely lasted because everyone was struggling to survive their own lives. Ethan had no wealthy relatives waiting to rescue him, no successful mentor opening doors, and no social media account filled with glamorous photos pretending everything was perfect. He was invisible in the way millions of hardworking people quietly become invisible. He did everything right, caused no trouble, paid his bills whenever possible, helped strangers whenever he could, and still woke up each morning wondering whether life would ever become anything more than an endless cycle of surviving until tomorrow. Despite everything, Ethan refused to let bitterness take root inside him. That surprised many people who knew his story. After losing both parents before finishing high school, He had every reason to believe the world owed him something. Instead, he believed kindness was one of the few things that became more valuable the more freely it was given. His mother had repeated those words throughout his childhood whenever they passed someone in need. Character isn't measured when life is easy, she used to tell him. It's measured when nobody expects you to help. Those lessons stayed with him long after she was gone. They explained why he always returned wallets without checking the cash inside, why he volunteered at neighborhood food drives whenever his schedule allowed, and why stray animals somehow always found their way to his apartment door. None of those choices earned him recognition. They certainly didn't improve his finances. Yet Ethan never viewed kindness as an investment expecting future rewards. To him, helping another person was simply the right thing to do, even if nobody else ever noticed. On that rainy evening, however, someone was watching far more closely than he could possibly imagine, and every quiet act from his past had already become part of a much larger picture. Rain had started shortly after sunset, turning crowded streets into reflections of red traffic lights and glowing storefronts. Most businesses closed early because of the weather, and commuters rushed toward buses and subway stations with their heads lowered beneath umbrellas. Ethan finished unloading his final delivery just after 9 o'clock and began the familiar walk toward home. His shoes were already soaked, his phone battery had nearly died, and the small paper bag containing the sandwich he planned to eat for dinner had become damp from the rain. He checked the time, calculated how many hours of sleep remained before tomorrow's shift, and quietly laughed to himself at the thought of another long day waiting just around the corner. Then he heard it. Not a scream, not a cry for help, just the uncertain voice of an elderly woman asking a passing stranger whether Maple Street was nearby. The stranger shrugged without stopping. A second person ignored her completely. A third glanced at her for only a second before crossing the road to avoid the conversation altogether. Ethan slowed his pace. He watched as the old woman looked around in confusion, clutching a faded handbag against her chest while rain dripped from silver strands of hair onto the pavement below. She looked frightened, but more than that, she looked forgotten. Within seconds, their eyes met across the sidewalk, and before either of them spoke another word, the course of both their lives had already begun to change. Ethan stepped beside the elderly woman and gently adjusted the jacket resting over her shoulders before offering his arm for support. She accepted with trembling hands, her grip surprisingly firm despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Everyone else seemed to be in such a hurry. Ethan answered with a small smile that barely showed beneath the falling rain. "Most people have somewhere they need to be. Tonight, I guess my destination can wait." The old woman looked at him for several seconds, almost as though she had expected a different answer. Then she nodded, and together they began walking beneath rows of flickering streetlights while the city continued moving around them without noticing either one. Cars rushed past. Storefronts locked their doors. Trains rumbled beneath the streets. It was just another rainy evening for everyone else. But for Ethan, every step was quietly carrying him toward a future that no amount of planning could have prepared him for. The woman introduced herself simply as Margaret. She never mentioned a last name, never spoke about her family, and answered most personal questions with a gentle smile that revealed almost nothing. Instead, she seemed far more interested in learning about the young man helping her than speaking about herself. "Do you live nearby?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "About 45 minutes from here if I keep walking." Margaret looked surprised. "And you're still willing to help an old stranger who doesn't even remember where she lives?" Ethan laughed softly. "If my grandmother were standing out here alone, I'd hope someone would stop for her too." Margaret lowered her eyes for a moment. The expression on her face suggested those words had reached somewhere deep inside her. "That's becoming a rare way of thinking," she replied quietly. Ethan simply shrugged. "Maybe, but rare doesn't mean impossible." They continued walking through neighborhood after neighborhood, while Margaret tried to remember familiar landmarks. Every few minutes, she would point toward a street with growing confidence, only to stop halfway there and quietly admit it didn't feel right. Ethan never complained. Whenever she apologized for forgetting again, he reassured her that they still had plenty of time. He could tell she was embarrassed by her confusion, so instead of asking questions that might pressure her, he began talking about ordinary things instead. He described funny customers from work, stories his mother used to tell him when he was a child, and the neighborhood bakery that made the best cinnamon rolls in the city. Before long, Margaret was smiling more often. She laughed at his stories with the warm, genuine laughter of someone who had not enjoyed simple conversation in a very long time. For nearly an hour, the rain, the cold, and the uncertainty surrounding them seemed to fade into the background as two strangers slowly became companions on an unexpected journey through the sleeping city. After another 15 minutes, Margaret suddenly stopped walking. She stared at the dark windows of a small neighborhood diner. "I remember this place," she said. "Years ago, someone brought me here after a very difficult day." Ethan noticed the exhaustion in her face and suggested they go inside for a few minutes to warm up. The diner was nearly empty except for a young waitress cleaning tables near the entrance. Ethan ordered 2 bowls of soup and a pot of hot tea, ignoring the fact that paying for both meals meant he would have almost nothing left in his wallet until payday. Margaret watched quietly as he counted the remaining bills before handing them to the cashier. She pretended not to notice, but her eyes lingered on the nearly empty wallet before returning to her tea. When the waitress stepped away, Margaret asked softly, "Was that your dinner money?" Ethan chuckled. "I'll survive." She looked at him carefully. Most people would have chosen themselves first. Ethan stirred his soup for a moment before answering. "Maybe, but tonight you needed it more than I did." Across the street, hidden behind rain-covered windows, the black luxury sedan remained parked exactly where it had been earlier. Inside, 2 men observed the diner through professional camera lenses. One of them lowered his binoculars and spoke quietly into an earpiece. Subject continues assisting without hesitation. No request for compensation. No suspicious behavior. A calm voice answered from the other end of the line. Continue observation. Do not interfere unless necessary. The call ended almost immediately. Neither man explained who they worked for or why they were documenting every decision Ethan made. Their instructions were simple. Watch, record, report, nothing more. As Ethan and Margaret finished their meal, another black SUV quietly joined the first vehicle across the street. Moments later, a third appeared farther down the block. None of them approached. None of them spoke. Yet every movement Ethan made was now being followed with remarkable attention. When they stepped back outside, the rain had eased into a gentle drizzle. Margaret looked stronger after eating, though the uncertainty about her destination remained. She closed her eyes for several seconds before pointing toward the northern part of the city. "I think maybe we should go that way." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Then that's where we'll go." They continued walking beneath rows of towering maple trees whose wet leaves shimmered beneath the streetlights. During the next hour, Margaret's questions became increasingly personal. "What is your greatest dream?" she asked. Ethan thought for a moment before answering honestly. "I don't dream about becoming rich. I just want enough stability to stop worrying every month whether I'll lose my apartment. I'd like to help people one day without wondering whether I can afford to." Margaret smiled faintly. "Interesting." Several minutes later, she asked another question. "If someone handed you $1 billion tomorrow, what would be the very first thing you would buy?" Ethan answered almost immediately. "Time." Margaret looked confused. "Time isn't something you can buy." Ethan smiled. "Maybe not literally. But money would let me work less, visit people more, volunteer more, and finally live instead of simply surviving. I'd rather have time than another expensive car." Margaret became unusually quiet after hearing that answer. She looked ahead without speaking for several blocks while memories seemed to pass through her mind one after another. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you know what the wealthiest people often lose first?" Ethan shook his head. "Trust," she replied. "The richer they become, the fewer honest conversations they have. Eventually, everyone wants something from them, and they forget what genuine kindness looks like." Ethan listened respectfully, but didn't fully understand why she sounded so certain. She spoke as though those words came from personal experience rather than imagination. Before he could ask another question, a black sedan slowly rolled past them, its tinted windows hiding everyone inside. Margaret glanced toward the vehicle for only a brief moment before continuing forward as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan noticed the car too, but assumed it belonged to another late-night commuter. He had no reason to suspect it had already passed them 3 different times within the last 30 minutes. Nearly 3 hours had passed since they first met. Ethan's phone had completely died, the streets had become almost empty, and the city felt strangely silent. Margaret suddenly stopped beneath an old stone bridge crossing a narrow river that divided two neighborhoods. She looked around carefully before speaking in a voice barely louder than the wind. "We're close now," she whispered. "I can feel it." Ethan smiled with relief. "That's good news." Margaret reached into her handbag as though searching for something, but paused halfway through the movement. Her eyes widened slightly. She looked behind them, then toward the bridge ahead. For the first time that entire evening, genuine concern appeared on her face. She took a slow breath before saying words Ethan would never forget. "Whatever happens next, promise me you won't run." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching engines echoed through the quiet street, growing louder with every passing second. The sound of engines grew louder until three black SUVs emerged from opposite ends of the street, their headlights cutting through the lingering rain like bright white walls. They slowed to a stop only a few feet from Ethan and Margaret, blocking both directions of the narrow road. Ethan instinctively stepped in front of the elderly woman, unsure whether they were about to witness a robbery or something far worse. Four men wearing dark suits stepped out almost simultaneously. Their movements were calm, disciplined, and strangely familiar, as though they had rehearsed the same routine hundreds of times before. None of them spoke immediately. One of the men walked forward, stopping several feet away before lowering his head respectfully toward Margaret. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we've been searching everywhere for you." Ethan looked from the man to Margaret in complete confusion. Only moments ago she had seemed frightened and completely dependent on his help. Now these professionally dressed men were treating her with a level of respect he had never seen before. Margaret let out a slow sigh, almost as though she had hoped this moment would arrive much later. She turned toward Ethan with an expression filled with gratitude and regret at the same time. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I should have explained sooner." Before Ethan could respond, another black vehicle pulled onto the bridge, followed by two more behind it. Within seconds, nearly a dozen security personnel surrounded the area, though none displayed weapons or behaved aggressively. Their attention remained fixed entirely on Margaret. The oldest member of the security team approached, carrying a large umbrella, and carefully held it above her head. "The board has been calling nonstop," he explained. "The media discovered you were missing almost 2 hours ago. Police units are searching every district. The governor has already been informed." Ethan stared in disbelief. Missing? Board? Governor? None of it made sense. Margaret slowly removed Ethan's rain-soaked jacket from her shoulders and folded it with surprising care before handing it back to him. "Thank you for keeping me warm," she said with genuine appreciation. Then, to Ethan's astonishment, every member of the security team lowered their heads at the same moment, waiting for her next instruction. She wasn't simply an elderly woman who had wandered away from home. She was someone whose disappearance had thrown an entire city into panic. Margaret smiled gently as she noticed the confusion on Ethan's face. "I suppose introductions are overdue." One of the security officers opened the rear door of the largest SUV, but she ignored it and remained standing beside Ethan instead. "My full name is Margaret Whitmore." Ethan politely nodded, though the name meant nothing to him. Seeing this, several members of the security detail exchanged surprised glances. One of them quietly whispered, "He doesn't know." Margaret almost laughed. "Of course he doesn't. That's exactly why we're here." She looked back at Ethan. "Have you ever heard of Whitmore Global Industries?" Ethan thought for several seconds before answering. "The company that owns hospitals, technology firms, shipping companies, renewable energy projects?" Margaret nodded. "I founded it nearly 50 years ago." Ethan felt the words strike him like a wave. Whitmore Global wasn't simply a successful corporation. It employed hundreds of thousands of people across several countries. Its influence reached governments, universities, charities, and entire industries. The woman standing beside him, who had struggled to remember street names only an hour earlier, was the founder of one of the largest business empires in the world. His first instinct was to believe there had been some mistake. Perhaps these people had confused her with someone else. Perhaps this was some elaborate misunderstanding. But then another vehicle arrived carrying local police officers. Instead of questioning Margaret, every officer immediately removed their caps and greeted her with remarkable respect. One officer apologized repeatedly for not locating her sooner. Another informed her that emergency operations had been activated throughout the city after security cameras lost track of her several hours earlier. Ethan suddenly remembered the black sedans that seemed to appear wherever they walked. The men watching from across the diner. The vehicles that quietly passed beneath the streetlights. They had never been random strangers. They had been protecting her from a distance the entire evening without revealing themselves. Everything he believed about that night shifted in an instant. Margaret noticed Ethan becoming overwhelmed and gently touched his arm. Please don't let any of this change the way you see me. Ethan struggled to find the right words. You said you couldn't remember where your house was. Margaret lowered her eyes briefly before answering with complete honesty. That part was true. My memory isn't what it once was. Some days I remember everything. Other days familiar places become strangers. My doctors warned me it would happen more often as time passed. Ethan remained silent, listening carefully. She continued. But I also made a decision several years ago. Once every year I leave my home without my title, without expensive clothes, and without anyone announcing who I am. I walk through the city exactly as you found me tonight. Ethan frowned in confusion. Why? Margaret looked toward the rain-covered skyline. Because wealth can build buildings, but it cannot reveal character. When people think you have nothing, they show you exactly who they are. She explained that during those yearly walks, most encounters ended the same way. Some people ignored her completely. Others became impatient after only a few minutes. A handful offered directions before continuing with their evening. On several occasions, people attempted to steal her handbag, believing it contained money or jewelry. One man had even laughed after telling her that old people should stay inside if they couldn't remember their own address. Margaret spoke about those moments without bitterness, but Ethan could hear the sadness hidden beneath every sentence. It's remarkable how invisible people become once society believes they have nothing left to offer, she said quietly. Age strips away many things. For some people, it even strips away dignity. Ethan lowered his head, thinking about all the strangers who had walked past her that evening without stopping. He wasn't angry with them. Most had probably been rushing home to families, jobs, or responsibilities of their own. Still, the realization stayed with him. Dozens of people had seen the same frightened elderly woman. Only one had chosen to stay. One member of Margaret's security team stepped forward carrying a tablet. Ma'am, the board insists you return immediately. Every news network is broadcasting live outside the estate. Margaret glanced at the screen before handing it back without looking. They can wait another few minutes. She turned once again toward Ethan. Would you allow me to repay your kindness? Ethan answered almost immediately. There's nothing to repay. She smiled. You gave nearly 4 hours of your life to a complete stranger. Ethan shook his head. Anyone should have done the same. Margaret's eyes softened. Perhaps they should have, but they didn't. She reached into her handbag and removed a small cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. There was no logo, no writing on the outside, only Ethan's first name written neatly across the front. Please take this, she said. Don't open it until tomorrow morning. Ethan hesitated before accepting it. The envelope felt surprisingly light, almost empty. What is it? Margaret smiled. An invitation. Before Ethan could ask another question, the security team quietly escorted Margaret toward the waiting SUV. She paused before entering and looked back one final time. Thank you, Ethan, she said. You reminded me that genuine kindness still exists. The door closed softly behind her. Moments later, the convoy pulled away, disappearing into the rain as quickly as it had arrived. Within seconds, the bridge became silent once again. Ethan stood alone beneath the streetlight, holding the mysterious envelope, while trying to convince himself that the last 4 hours had actually happened. Across the city, television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news. Reporters announced that billionaire philanthropist Margaret Whitmore had been found safe after a citywide search that captivated millions. Crowds outside her estate erupted into cheers. Markets scheduled for opening overseas reacted instantly. Social media flooded with speculation about where she had been and who had helped bring her home. Yet among thousands of headlines appearing around the world, no one knew the identity of the exhausted young man quietly walking back to his tiny apartment with nothing more than a damp jacket, an empty wallet, and an unopened envelope that would change his life forever. Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret standing alone beneath the rain, her trembling voice asking for help as though she were just another forgotten grandmother trying to find her way home. Then the memory shifted to the convoy of black SUVs, the security officers lowering their heads, and the revelation that the woman he had escorted through the city was one of the most influential people in the country. None of it felt real. He placed the unopened envelope on the small table beside his bed and stared at it for nearly an hour before finally deciding to wait until morning, just as Margaret had requested. Whatever was inside could wait a few more hours. He had never been the type of person to ignore someone's wishes, especially not hers. Outside, dawn slowly pushed away the rain clouds, while television stations continued replaying footage of Margaret Whitmore returning safely to her estate. Experts debated how someone with such extraordinary influence could disappear without anyone noticing. Some criticized her security team. Others questioned whether the disappearance had been staged. Social media exploded with theories ranging from kidnapping attempts to elaborate publicity campaigns. None of them came close to the truth. The only person who actually knew what had happened was quietly sitting inside a tiny apartment eating dry toast, because he couldn't afford anything else before payday. When the first rays of sunlight entered the room, Ethan carefully broke the dark blue wax seal. Inside the envelope was a single handwritten letter and a heavy silver keycard embossed with the Whitmore Global emblem. The letter was remarkably short. "Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then you honored my request, and that tells me even more about your character. Please meet me today at 10 o'clock in the morning at Whitmore Estate. Come exactly as you are. There is nothing you need to buy, nothing you need to prepare, and nothing you need to fear. We have much to discuss. Margaret." Ethan read the letter 3 times before looking at the old clock hanging above his kitchen sink. It was already a little after 8. The estate was nearly an hour away by bus. He hurried to get ready, wearing the only formal shirt he owned, carefully ironing it despite the faded collar and worn cuffs. Looking into the cracked bathroom mirror, he almost laughed. There was nothing about his appearance that belonged inside the mansion of a billionaire. His shoes had been repaired so many times that even the stitching had stitching. His watch had stopped working months earlier. Yet Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "Come exactly as you are." Somehow, those 5 words gave him enough confidence to leave the apartment without turning back. Whitmore Estate looked even larger in daylight than it had the previous night. Massive iron gates stretched across the entrance, guarded by uniformed security officers who stood with remarkable precision. Beyond the gates, perfectly maintained gardens surrounded a mansion that seemed more like a museum than a private residence. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before approaching the entrance. One of the guards looked at him politely. "May I help you?" Ethan nervously removed the silver keycard from his pocket. The moment the guard saw it, his expression changed completely. He spoke quietly into a communication device attached to his collar, then smiled warmly. "Mr. Carter, we've been expecting you." Within seconds, the gates slowly opened. Ethan couldn't ignore the strange feeling that everyone inside already knew who he was, even though he had never met any of them before. A young assistant greeted him at the front entrance and led him through enormous hallways decorated with paintings, sculptures, and photographs documenting decades of charitable work around the world. Every employee they passed smiled respectfully. No one questioned why an ordinary young man dressed in inexpensive clothes was walking through one of the most secure private properties in the country. It was as though Margaret's invitation alone had erased every barrier that normally separated people from different worlds. Margaret was waiting inside a sunlit library overlooking acres of gardens. Gone were the worn clothes and tired appearance from the night before. She wore an elegant cream-colored suit, her silver hair neatly arranged, yet her smile remained exactly the same. The warmth Ethan had seen beneath the streetlights hadn't disappeared simply because she had returned to her mansion. "Good morning, Ethan," she said as though they were old friends meeting again after a brief absence. "Did you find us without getting lost?" Ethan smiled awkwardly. "Fortunately, yes." She laughed softly before inviting him to sit beside a large fireplace. Fresh breakfast had been prepared, but Ethan noticed something unusual. Margaret served his coffee herself rather than asking one of the household staff to do it. Every gesture seemed intentional. Every conversation unfolded naturally. She asked whether he had arrived safely, whether he had slept well, and whether his shoes had finally dried after walking through the rain. For several minutes, they spoke about ordinary things instead of wealth, business, or headlines. It almost felt as though the previous night's revelation had never happened. Then Margaret folded her hands together and looked directly at him. "I owe you the full truth." She explained that her annual walks through the city were never random acts of curiosity. Years earlier, after watching trusted executives betray lifelong friendships over money and influence, she realized that resumes, interviews, and glowing recommendations rarely revealed who people truly were. Character appeared most clearly when there was nothing to gain. That realization led her to create what she privately called the Kindness Walk. Once every year, she left behind the comfort of her estate and became an ordinary elderly woman searching for help. Hidden security teams ensured her safety from a distance, but they were instructed never to interfere unless her life was genuinely at risk. During those walks, she observed how complete strangers treated someone they believed had no power, no wealth, and no importance. Over the years, she encountered every imaginable response. Some people politely apologized before walking away. Others mocked her confusion. A few offered directions while remaining impatient. Several people pretended to help only after recognizing hidden cameras, believing they might appear on television. Yet only a handful willingly sacrificed their own time without expecting recognition or reward. Ethan listened quietly, slowly understanding why she had asked such unusual questions throughout the evening. Every answer, every decision, and every small act of compassion had become part of something much larger than a simple walk home. Margaret stood and retrieved a thick leather folder from a nearby desk. She placed it gently in front of Ethan before opening it. Inside were photographs, reports, handwritten notes, and surveillance images spanning several months. Ethan's expression changed as he recognized himself in many of them. There was a photograph showing him returning a lost wallet to an elderly veteran outside a grocery store. Another captured him helping a delivery driver whose truck had broken down during winter. There was an image of him volunteering at a neighborhood food bank on his only day off that month. One report described how he anonymously paid for medication belonging to a child whose mother couldn't afford the prescription. Ethan looked up in disbelief. "You've been watching me?" Margaret nodded honestly. "Not because I doubted you. Because I wanted to understand whether the kindness I saw last night was part of who you are or simply one good decision." Ethan remained speechless. Every quiet moment of compassion he believed had gone unnoticed had somehow been carefully documented. None of those actions had earned him praise at the time. He had never expected them to. Yet someone had been paying attention all along. Margaret slowly closed the folder and looked out across the gardens before speaking again. People believe building a successful company is about finding brilliant minds. They're only partly right. Intelligence creates opportunity. Character determines what happens after opportunity arrives. She turned back toward Ethan with remarkable calm. "For several years I've searched for someone capable of protecting what I've spent my entire life building. Not because I intend to retire tomorrow, but because time eventually asks every leader the same question. Who comes next?" Ethan immediately shook his head. "I don't belong in this world." Margaret smiled. "Neither did I when I started." Before he could respond, the library doors suddenly opened. 3 sharply dressed executives entered carrying stacks of documents. None of them appeared pleased to see Ethan sitting beside Margaret. One of the men looked directly at him before addressing Margaret with obvious concern. "Ma'am, the emergency board meeting is ready. We need to discuss the succession announcement before the media arrives." Margaret answered without hesitation. "Good. Because today's announcement concerns him." Every face in the room slowly turned toward Ethan. Confusion quickly gave way to disbelief. One executive quietly muttered, "You've got to be kidding." Another tightened his grip on the folder in his hands. Ethan felt the atmosphere change instantly. Whatever Margaret was about to announce, it wasn't simply going to surprise the board. It was going to challenge everything they believed about power, influence, and who deserved to inherit it. Silence settled across the boardroom so completely that even the ticking of the antique clock mounted above the fireplace seemed unusually loud. Every executive stared at Ethan as though Margaret had just announced that a complete stranger would be flying the nation's most advanced aircraft without ever entering a cockpit. The expressions around the room ranged from disbelief to quiet anger. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others reached for their phones before thinking better of it. Margaret remained seated at the head of the long oak table, her composure unchanged. She had witnessed moments like this throughout her career. She knew exactly what people looked like when power slipped beyond their control. Finally, the senior executive, Richard Donovan, leaned forward and folded his hands. "With all due respect, Margaret," he began, choosing each word carefully. "This young man has no corporate experience. He has never managed an international company. He has no financial background, no executive training, and no understanding of how an organization this size operates." Several board members nodded immediately. Ethan couldn't argue with a single point. Everything Richard said was true. He had never claimed otherwise. Before he could speak, Margaret calmly replied, "You're absolutely right. He has none of those things. Skills can be taught. Integrity cannot." The room fell silent again. Richard stood and walked toward the enormous window overlooking the estate. "You're asking us to trust the future of Whitmore Global to someone we met less than 5 minutes ago." Margaret smiled faintly. "No, Richard. You met him 5 minutes ago. I've been learning about him for months." She slid the leather folder across the table. One by one, the executives opened it. Inside were the same reports Ethan had seen in the library. Only this collection was even more extensive. There were witness statements from community organizations describing his volunteer work, letters from families he had quietly helped, security footage showing him returning valuables that could easily have disappeared without anyone noticing, and recommendations from people who had no idea they were being asked to evaluate him. None of them mentioned extraordinary achievements. Instead, they described ordinary moments repeated over and over again, acts of honesty performed when nobody expected recognition. Margaret allowed the board members several minutes to read every page before speaking again. "Tell me honestly," she asked, "how many executives have we hired because their resumes looked impressive, only to discover later that they couldn't be trusted with the people they managed?" No one answered. They all knew the number was higher than anyone wanted to admit. Ethan finally found the courage to speak. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think there's been a misunderstanding." I turned toward him. "I'm grateful for everything you've said, but I'm not the person you're looking for. I don't know how to run a company worth billions of dollars. I wouldn't even know where to begin." Margaret's smile grew warmer. "That's exactly why you're here." Ethan looked puzzled. She continued, "The most dangerous leaders are often the ones who believe they already know everything. The best leaders begin by admitting what they still need to learn." She slowly stood and walked toward a large photograph hanging on the wall. It showed Whitmore Global's very first office, a tiny rented room with 3 desks and peeling paint. "When I started this company," she said, "I had no experience leading an international corporation either. There was no international corporation. There was only an idea and a promise that every employee would be treated with dignity. Somewhere along the way, as we grew larger, too many people forgot that promise." She turned back toward the board. "This company was never built to make a handful of executives wealthy. It was built to improve lives." The discussion continued for hours. Lawyers entered and left the room carrying legal documents. Financial advisors presented reports. Board members debated succession plans, voting procedures, and corporate governance. Ethan listened quietly, speaking only when someone asked him a direct question. The more he listened, the more he realized that Margaret wasn't asking him to replace decades of experience overnight. She wanted someone who would protect the values upon which the company had been founded while learning from people who genuinely cared about its future. Late that afternoon, after every concern had been raised and every objection discussed, Margaret made her final decision. She announced that Ethan would enter an intensive leadership program under her direct mentorship. He would spend the coming years learning every part of the business, working alongside employees at every level, from warehouse staff and customer service teams to engineers, researchers, hospital administrators, and senior executives. If, after that journey, he remained the same compassionate man she had met beneath the rain, he would one day become the company's next chief executive officer. It wasn't an inheritance. It wasn't a gift. It was an opportunity to earn responsibility. The announcement reached the public within minutes. News organizations interrupted regular programming once again. Headlines questioned why an unknown delivery worker had suddenly become the most discussed future business leader in America. Television debates lasted for weeks. Some commentators praised Margaret's courage. Others called the decision reckless. Social media became a battlefield of opinions. Strangers searched Ethan's past hoping to uncover hidden scandals. Former classmates who had barely spoken to him suddenly gave interviews describing him as an old friend. Distant relatives appeared from nowhere claiming close family connections. Companies offered him lucrative contracts simply to associate their brands with his growing reputation. Yet through every interview request and every public conversation, Ethan politely declined attention. Instead of appearing on magazine covers, he reported to Whitmore Global every morning before sunrise, beginning exactly where Margaret insisted he should begin, not in an executive office, but beside warehouse employees loading trucks for delivery. He learned their names. He listened to their concerns. He ate lunch with custodians, security guards, receptionists, nurses, technicians, and factory workers. Whenever someone asked why the future leader of the company spent so much time with ordinary employees, his answer never changed. You can't improve people's lives if you've never taken the time to understand them. 5 years later, Margaret Whitmore officially retired. The ceremony was broadcast across the world. Investors expected a polished executive with decades of corporate experience to take the stage. Instead, Ethan walked to the podium wearing a simple navy suit and the same old wristwatch he had finally repaired instead of replacing. He looked across thousands of employees gathered inside the company's headquarters before beginning his first speech as chief executive officer. He didn't speak about profits, stock prices, or market dominance. He spoke about dignity. He announced the largest employee scholarship program in the company's history, expanded healthcare benefits for every worker regardless of position, introduced affordable housing initiatives for lower-income staff, and created emergency funds to support employees facing unexpected hardship. Financial analysts predicted disaster. They argued the company was spending too much on people. Yet the opposite happened. Productivity increased. Employee loyalty reached record levels. Innovation accelerated. Customers responded positively to a company that genuinely invested in its workforce. Within 3 years, Whitmore Global became more successful than at any point in its history. The values Margaret had spent a lifetime protecting had finally found a leader willing to place people before prestige. Margaret lived long enough to witness those changes. On her final visit to company headquarters, she quietly watched employees laughing together in the cafeteria Ethan insisted should serve free meals to anyone working late. She visited the child care center he had built for working parents. She toured the medical clinic available to every employee and their families regardless of salary. Before leaving, she found Ethan standing alone beside the same framed photograph of the company's first office. "You know," she said with a smile, "people still ask me why I chose you." Ethan laughed softly. "And what do you tell them?" Margaret looked toward the window, where hundreds of employees crossed the courtyard below. "I tell them I didn't choose the man who helped an old woman find her way home." She paused before continuing. "I chose the man who would have done exactly the same thing even if no one had ever found out." Ethan stood quietly, remembering that rainy night beneath the streetlights. He had expected nothing in return for helping a frightened stranger. He hadn't known her name. He hadn't recognized her face. He certainly hadn't imagined she possessed unimaginable wealth. He simply saw someone who needed help and decided not to walk away. Margaret passed away peacefully several months later. At her private memorial service, attended by world leaders, business executives, and thousands of employees whose lives she had transformed, Ethan spoke only one sentence before placing a single white rose beside her photograph. "The greatest gift she ever gave the world wasn't her fortune," he said. "It was reminding us that kindness still has the power to change history." Those words spread across newspapers, television broadcasts, and classrooms around the world. Yet for Ethan, they weren't a speech prepared for an audience. They were the simple truth. Every headline claiming that Ethan Carter became famous because he met the richest woman in America missed the point entirely. Fame wasn't the reason his story mattered. Wealth wasn't the lesson. The real turning point happened long before reporters arrived, before helicopters filled the sky, before board meetings, business announcements, and international headlines. It happened on a quiet sidewalk during a rainy night when everyone else kept walking, and one tired young man decided that another person's safety mattered more than getting home a little sooner. That single choice changed one life, then thousands, and eventually millions. It proved something the world often forgets, that the smallest act of compassion can become the beginning of a story far greater than anyone could ever imagine. So now we'd like to hear from you. If you had been in Ethan's place that rainy night, exhausted after a long day with nothing waiting for you except a small apartment and another early morning, would you have stopped to help Margaret, or would you have continued walking? Share your thoughts in the comments below because every perspective adds something meaningful to the conversation. And if this story reminded you that kindness still matters, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you in the next unforgettable story.